So now let's look at the rise and rise of the mighty JavaScript. You can't really be a top-end web developer without having an understanding of the JavaScript paradigm. And this is in many respects taking over the world in terms of dominance on the website environment in web development. So why is it popular? Well, it started off as a client-side language, and really you had kids playing around with JavaScript in the background, just creating games for websites. Those kids are now grown up and they are key developers within the JavaScript environment. Primarily, it was created for front-end development, so client-side development, nothing to do with back-end because, of course, back in the day, those websites were primarily front-end. However, today it's got front-end, client-side functionality as well as server-side functionality and everything in between. There's pretty much a library for everything you need to do within the whole JavaScript family. Back in the day, when it was launched in the late 1990s, it was designed for Netscape Navigator. And in those days, it didn't even function on a number of other browsers. So Microsoft's Internet Explorer didn't even accept the JavaScript standard until much later on. In fact, Microsoft had its own version of JavaScript, which they would call JScript. But thankfully, JavaScript was the one that took a hold. It's an open environment, so you've got a community base that constantly adds to, amends, and perfects the JavaScript source code. Now, let's talk about where JavaScript comes in. So it's well worth you understanding that today, JavaScript is both a client-side and a server-side scripting language. So don't assume that it's just client-side anymore. What do those terms actually mean? So client-side scripting is really just to do with creating a lovely interactive GUI component at the front end. And it doesn't have anything really to do with invoking anything from the server or having really complex functionality in terms of business logic. When you think about client-side scripting, well, the libraries that come into play are jQuery, AngularJS, React.js, Require.js, Respond.js, and Knockout.js. Undoubtedly, by the time you're viewing this, there are going to be other libraries because new ones are added all the time, and that's the beauty of the JavaScript community.
Any ideas?
But whenever you see any of these terms, it pretty much indicates that this is client-side activity taking place. Now, what I mean by that is things like a clock, a calendar, things that don't really need heavy involvement from the server side, little components like buttons and drop-down menus on the website can all be done with a client-side script. However, when things get complicated, then of course you need to invoke data or functionality from the back end, and this is where server-side scripting comes in. So JavaScript has a whole host of libraries that are primarily designed for more complex server-side functionality. You can actually do server-side scripting with languages like Python, Ruby, and PHP if you wanted. So you could actually have JavaScript working just on the client side using something like AngularJS and use PHP or Python scripts to go back and do all the heavy lifting from the back end. But why would you need to? Because of course you've got libraries within JavaScript's family that allows you to do that. Some key libraries here are Node.js and Sales.js. So they will allow you to do all the running backwards and forwards from the server. Now, in order to illustrate what I'm saying here, let's just look at something like the EasyJet website. If you look at the EasyJet website, there's functionality here which is front end and they would have been done using something like Angular. But as soon as, let's just flick down here, standard SPA with minimal refresh of the screen, of course, as I mentioned earlier. But as soon as we do something like put in some information, put in some dates, you can see that the standard dates start to take place. Doesn't look like I'll be flying to Milan anytime soon during this lockout, but let's go for it anyway, and let's give it a nice long holiday. And I press search. So there you had a server-side script working, going to the back end and looking for things. And essentially here it's asking me for some information again, so I'll put that back in again, and let's say we do that. And I'm assuming these are the days of lockdown, by the way, that there will be no flights. So there are no flights, but it's giving me a lot more information, and it's even gone back and brought back some advertising of hotels. So all of this would be kept in the database at the back end, and the script has allowed me to invoke those. Now, of course, here it's the same with hotel bookings as well. When we put in things like this, this is filters that are being applied, and this is going back and forwards to the website's server and bringing in really fast, actually, all the hotels that I'm using within that period of time. So all of these hotels are relevant to the search that I'm making, and it's bringing those really quickly. And so these are server-side scripts, probably done in JavaScript, going backwards and forwards.
Any ideas?
Let's speak a little more about AngularJS. And as I mentioned earlier, it adds interactivity to a blank HTML page, and it tells HTML when to invoke certain JavaScript events. As I said, it could be front or back end. However, primarily nowadays, AngularJS is used for the front end and increases the responsiveness of your site. It also works beautifully with JSON and jQuery, and we'll speak a little about those in following lessons. But the cool thing about AngularJS is that if you've got a typical web page loading, as I mentioned earlier, then essentially when you load a typical web page and you click on anything on that web page, the whole page had to load up. So there was a momentary flicker, and if you did it in pure HTML, well, the whole thing had to be reloaded in the browser. And this increased traffic to the back end. Each time you were doing it, it meant slower pages, and it was an inefficient use of the bandwidth. However, once Angular came on, it meant that the same thing could happen. If you clicked anywhere on the page, then it was only that certain element that needed to be refreshed, and this meant, of course, much more efficiency and good use of the network. So what does it look like? AngularJS looks like this within HTML. So very, very similar. Now, if you went to the JavaScript community and you looked for, let's say, a clock or a calendar as a web developer, well, actually, it would look like this. And essentially, all you do is you cut and paste this into your HTML, and voila, you have a clock. There is now much more of a trend towards stacks as well. So people like web developers who work in entire stacks, and this is a full stack developer within the JavaScript paradigm. So essentially here, if you speak to clients, they will often ask for a web developer who has knowledge of the mean stack. And what that means is, mean stands for MongoDB, Express.js underneath, AngularJS underneath there, and then Node.js there as well. Now, not everything here is to do with JavaScript, but primarily it is a JavaScript-based framework. So MongoDB is a database, up and coming. It's a NoSQL database, very prominent now in the big data environment, and the business intelligence community loves MongoDB. So it's a NoSQL database, which means it deals with unstructured data, really in at the moment. Then there's Express.js, which is another light framework or library for building single-page applications within JavaScript. There's AngularJS for building powerful front-end components, and you've got Node.js as well. So when you're looking at a web developer who's familiar with the mean stack, what they're saying to you is, I am very familiar with all of these technologies, and I know that these technologies work beautifully well with each other. So clients, rather than saying to you, can you bring us someone with Mongo and Express and Angular and Node, they will just say, can you find us web developers who are familiar and efficient with the mean stack. Other stacks include LAMP, which stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. Let's move on now to why JavaScript did achieve such popularity. Well, the key thing is there was a huge emphasis and rise in front-end functionality within websites around the world. And of course, as I said earlier, we are using handheld web devices to interact with most of the applications in our life now. So of course the front end became a huge deal. The efficiency, the beauty, the interactivity of the front end became a big thing. Then there was the rise and rise of WordPress type sites around the world and the SPA approach that I've just spoken about. JavaScript allows fast development with great functionality, and you don't have to create it from scratch because there's probably a library with that functionality already in there. Node gives really strong backend capability, and so JavaScript can solve the front end and the back end problem. JavaScript has been accepted by both the iOS and Android communities, so it's a standard that is actually workable in most environments. As I said earlier, there's a huge selection of established libraries that are driven by the open community. It ties in really beautifully with JSON, and you can hear about JSON in the next lesson. But JSON gives great data processing across most browsers, and we'll speak about that. Finally, GitHub, which is a community and a repository of code. GitHub and Grunt allow huge repositories of code to be widely shared. So Grunt and GitHub are both these repositories where people with new ideas and new functionality all contribute their code, and it's a great area where developers can share information and share code and share ideas. So if you need a piece of code to do something, the likelihood is go in there first, check it out, and someone has probably already done it for you. If it's a mortgage calculator you need, it's probably there. If it's a virtual reality type environment that you need, it's already in there. So essentially, people are innovative in the open community and they start contributing their ideas. And especially with the rise of 5G around the world, if smartphone functionality becomes much more sophisticated, and if the network increases its bandwidth so that we can actually have things like virtual reality or even some radical holographic device in the palm of our hand, well, all of the new code will be shared on GitHub and Grunt and Stack Overflow, and people will be able to share those around. JavaScript components are being added every day, and so that contributes to the strength of JavaScript. Now you understand why JavaScript is becoming one of the most popular languages in the world today.